Welcome back to another episode of the Bear Trap, a Bears podcast by a Bears fan. I'm your host, Terry, and today talking about the rest of the Bears 2019 NFL draft class. So yesterday we talked a little bit about our first pick, not first round, but our first pick in the third round, which was David Montgomery, running back out of Iowa State. And then today the draft is completed. So we're going to kind of look over. And as I said before, mentioned, like, I haven't been as deep into this draft as prior times, but also I would say just in general, these are some players that, I didn't really study that much as well. So some very lower tier players as you expect in the end of the round, but also some players that probably most people thought wouldn't be drafted. So yeah, we're going to go through more so what the, plan of attack and strategy was in the draft more so than each individual player, but I will make comments on each one. So anyway, kind of if you want to go back and look at what I talked about with David Montgomery, that's all there. So then we're talking about Riley Ridley today as our first pick in the fourth round. This was an interesting pick. I mean, not just because of Riley Ridley, but because of the position. So taking a wide receiver when we pretty much put a lot of capital in receiver, between up until this point of the draft, I would say. So whether you're talking about the free agency of last year, the draft of last year, and then the free agency of this year, bringing in Cordell Patterson. I know some people are ready to argue how he's a running back, but then you talk about Tariq Cohen and all the other running backs we just got. So there's that. And then you also talk about he wasn't used that way by anybody except the Patriots. So we know he can do multiple things, but he still got paid as a receiver / returner, whatever. And so bringing him in, but along with the rest of our core of receivers, which you could argue, Anthony Miller, Allen Robinson, you worry about their, injuries. You think about that a little bit. And so there's definitely some, room for depth, but for a draft with limited picks, it was interesting because you get the, teammate and opposite starter from Riley Ridley last year, which was Javon Wims. He's on the team too after making it through cuts and showing to be pretty impressive in the limited time he did. And so then you get his teammate / running mate. And, you know, you kind of wonder what we're, doing with that pick because if you look at Georgia, Ridley wasn't better than Wims at that time either. And so now you're bringing him in with Wims, who has NFL experience on top of a depth chart that has a lot of money into it. So I just wonder where exactly are we planning in putting him? I mean, of course we're going to let him compete, but I just think you put so much capital into the receiver position, not to mention Trey Burton as a flex tight end. And then you have limited capital as far as the draft because of the other moves you made to pick a wide receiver. That's not the position I would have went for. And I know there's the whole need versus best player available. But the thing is, I would say, yeah, maybe in the first 3 rounds. But once you start talking about fourth round and lower, I don't know if that applies as much, especially in this draft. This is a super weak draft for offensive skill positions. And so I would not sit here and say that, oh, we just had to have Riley Ridley. Even though receiver isn't a spot that we needed to target. So that's me personally. Now, as far as the actual player, I did see Riley Ridley watch his tape. He's not Calvin. If you don't know, he's the younger brother of Calvin Ridley, who was a star at Alabama and a star for Atlanta Falcons this year. A lot of people doubted him coming out of the combine and, you know, as a prospect. But for me, I always said, Calvin, dude, look, there's nobody running routes like him. I haven't seen routes like that since like Robert Woods, who was one of the best route runners I saw coming out of college. And so Calvin really ended up showing up in the NFL. Riley's not Calvin. I mean, he's built slender and, a strong, slender frame, maybe a little stronger than Calvin. But Riley does not have the same speed and does not have nearly the same type of route running as Calvin does. And so while you got big SEC competition, you're talking about real pro style coaching in Alabama and some natural talent that Calvin had that Riley just didn't have. And so, if you wanted to compare those two side by side, which a lot of people will, again, Calvin just doesn't have the same explosiveness, as a physical trait, and just as a technique trait, he doesn't have the same route running. Now, when you're talking about a nice size frame, you're talking about a nice catch radius, a solid yak receiver, all that good stuff. It's there, but again, we're talking about the 4th round, and you can see why he dropped to the 4th round. So when we're talking about our picks, they're all low round picks, so no one's going to be spectacular. But when we're talking about position, I wonder why receiver right there, especially when you look at the rest of the draft. So then you go to the 6th round, we get Duke Shelley out of Kansas State. And he didn't go to the combine. And so really not a whole lot on him as far as number wise. I know he might have his, pro day numbers, but still the guy measures in about 5'9", 173. That's super small. I worry about that. I mean, yeah, corners aren't the biggest people, but just, short arms, small hands, really skinny frame. Not much power in his tackling. So, I watched a little bit of him, but I'm not going to claim I know him a lot. But I just wonder about that pick. This is a guy that a lot of people thought might not be drafted. And so for him to go as our 6th round pick when we had 2 7th round picks, that's a little interesting. My thought process is when you see a guy that's small is that you're talking about a nickel corner. But again, I don't know what his stats are. I mean, he moves well on the video that I watched. It's talking about movement skills, so he's not stiff-hipped or anything. So we'll kind of see, but I'm expecting a nickel out of that. And again, D-back was probably the one position that I looked at as the Bears and was like, yeah, that's probably what we need. Again, I did the mock draft game. You could check out that video. And going into it, mock drafting for the Bears, I'm like, yeah, the one thing that really glares is secondary, whether it's corner depth or safety depth. And then after that, it was offensive line. So, I mean, running back was definitely one that I wanted to hit. But I already talked about with Montgomery. I felt I could hit later. And so that wasn't a priority for me, but cornerback definitely was. So again, you get people in, you are able to get that coaching, get that locker room. Nobody has to step into a starting spot right away. Even if Buster Skrine's not great, we don't know that yet. He's going to walk in as the starter. Clint Dix is going to walk in as starter. Prince is back. But when we're talking about for the future, these are some guys we want to mold. And then 7th round. Now this was a real interesting pick. There's definitely Singletary coming out of Florida Atlantic, who was the bigger name this year, and his kind of running mate White kind of didn't get as much popping. And he did pop out on tape a little bit, but you're talking about a sort of 2-headed monster. I would say Henderson got a lot more carries, but definitely a guy that split some time. So there's always those questions about, can he carry the load? What can he do? Even though he's walking into a situation, he doesn't have to carry the load. So a lot of questions there about splitting time being a spread type running back. However, just the fact of running back, as I mentioned, a thing would have been a nice luxury, and running backs are dimes a dozen. Like, look, you could draft a guy like Jordan Howard, for example. You draft him in the lower rounds. He steps in, becomes the starter, becomes good leverage for you to, use later on, really helps the team. And if they stay healthy, they're perfectly fine. So you don't need to draft 7 running backs. You just need to hit with one good one. David Montgomery is a guy I really like. So then to come back in the 7th round where you have needs, again, to take a running back when we already took a running back, and then you have Tariq Cohen and supposedly Cordero Patterson, who could do some running stuff too, that it worries me a little bit. Yes, he does fit the system. He's more of an explosive, spread type runner. All that's good. Tariq Cohen's probably better at it though, but I get the depth, but we don't have 7 picks. We don't have 8 picks, 10 picks. We only have a handful of picks and none in the first 2 rounds. So I just think when you have a short amount of picks, I personally think you need to be even more decisive about the needs. But some people will say, no, even if you got 1 pick, just best player available and that's it. I don't know if that's exactly the case. So none against the player, just really, again, did we need to take 2 running backs with our 5 picks in the draft? Then lastly, you got Stephen Denmark, who isn't too far from a guy like Derek Williams or Derek Thomas that I was talking about from Baylor. You're talking about a height, weight, speed, prospect where the guy has some tremendous size and some great movement skills, didn't play at a big time competition and wasn't the best of technique, but you're talking about 6'3", 220. He weighed in at almost 34-inch arms, which is huge, and almost 10-inch hands. That's huge as well. So you're talking about a guy that can be molded. I would venture to think they're talking about moving him to safety. 220 is a really big corner, especially at 6'3". And with the fact that we need safety help now, they announced him as a cornerback, but that has changed during training camp many a times for many players. So I would imagine they might have some looks at him as safety as well. But of course, he's going to be a special teamer. So adding more defensive back depth, not a problem with it at all. 7th round is when you want to take a flyer. And that's kind of the same flyer that I was trying to take with Derek Thomas as the cornerback out of Baylor. So, not mad at it at all, especially if we can convert him to a safety, because that's a pretty big dude. So yeah, 7th round, you can't be too mad at taking that swing. So that is our draft class. I mean, as we get into the off season, and I'll talk more about, what our depth chart and what our roster looks like and all that good stuff. But this isn't last year. And even with last year, the draft didn't necessarily change everything. Well, it changed a lot. It was Khalil Mack that really changed everything. But last year, you think about this time, we added 3 starters. You had Roquan, unfortunately the whole holdout situation, but you got Roquan, who was a difference maker on the defense. Then you got James Daniels, who became a starter. You got Anthony Miller, who came in as a starter and did some things. So the draft last year, and then Bilal Nichols, who didn't really start but made some big plays. The draft last year really shaped up a foundation. That's not this year. So Bears fans, I saw people who complain like, why aren't we picking? Like, cause we don't have picks. Like, pay attention. And I said that when Khalil Mack got to the Bears, I'm like, watch, you're going to have people come draft time like, man, how come we don't have picks? And so anyway, you got some people that just want action. They want us to trade. They want us to do something. They want us to do a bunch of moves. Look, the Bears stayed pat. That's exactly what I did in the mock draft game. Didn't draft any of the players that I drafted, but hey, that's where we are. So, overall, like I said, I shouldn't be too shocked to see underdogs and more small time school guys on the roster. That's kind of been Ryan Pace's MO. I am shocked though that we went receiver and 2 running backs. If you said, hey, we were going to take 3 out of the 5 picks and make them offensive players, I wouldn't have been mad at that. I would have expected 2 of them to be offensive linemen though. So that's kind of where I'm at. And we really haven't done well with those free agents either. So, Massey is what he is. He needs to be replaced. Kind of everybody since, Slauson and those guys left, the ones that we had for free agent and sitting, we haven't really clicked. How long when he's healthy, he can do his thing. Cody Whitehair, I already said, needs to be a guard. James Daniels, I think, should be a center. So we got that there, but it would have been nice to get a tackle or somebody on the offensive line to provide some depth. And then we did get 2 secondary guys. And I fear that it's just a Deion Bush and, DeAndre Hall and all those other guys type situation when we drafted all these D-backs that didn't amount to anything. So I fear that that's what this is going to be. But hey, when you get good coaching around them, all you can do is kind of sit back and wait and see what they do. So nothing too sexy this year, I will say that. But all right, that's kind of my thoughts. So we'll get into it more as we get into the off season. So that is the draft. It's wrapped up. It's in the books. Go down in the comment section. Let me know what you think about our picks. Thumbs up, subscribe, share it around, get the conversation started. And remember, stay up and bear down.